Through a Scottish Prism, the programme that is unapologetically pro-Scottish independence and anti-Westminster rule. Everything we say here is viewed through a Scottish prism. Brought to you by Barhead Boy.
Hi folks, and welcome back to Midweek Through a Scottish Prism special. I hope you and yours are well. I'm delighted tonight to welcome you all here because I'm a very special guest, a good friend of the programme, and it is none other than Craig Murray. Craig, welcome back. It's been a long time since we had a wee chat. Nice to see you again.
Yeah, good to see you. Yeah, it's been too long.
Yeah, you've been up to all sorts of things, and why we've got you here, I wonder, I'd like to talk to you about what you're going to be doing at the UN with Salvo Liberation, but firstly, could you talk us through about your trip to Lebanon during the bombing campaign, etc. The first question I've got to ask you is, why did you go there during a bombing campaign?
Yeah, well, I guess I went there because of the bombing campaign. I've obviously been very upset by the genocide in Gaza, and the feeling it gives us all of helplessness, inability to do anything to stop it, when for over a year and a half now, these terrible images of children being killed, we see day after day after day. And I decided to try and go to Gaza to help report it, but I just couldn't find any way that would get me into Gaza. So I then decided to go to the West Bank and look at Israeli incursions in the West Bank. But you need permission from Israel to enter the West Bank because they control all the entrances, even the one from Jordan. And I couldn't get permission from Kogat, from the occupying Israeli authority. And then when the war started in a hot way in Lebanon, I realized that there's no power that could keep me out of Lebanon and keep me away from the front line there. So I decided to go to Lebanon, but I'll be open about it. I wanted to go to Gaza or the West Bank. I couldn't get into either. So I went to Lebanon to witness the Israeli aggression. And it was an absolutely true story. When I turned up, we flew on a plane. I went with Niels Laderfoyd, the Icelandic cinematographer. And we arrived on a flight from Rome. It was a large jet, I think an Airbus 320. There were 6 people on it going in because nobody was flying into a war zone. And we arrived, and the customs official, immigration official, said to me, "Aren't you scared to come here during a war?" And I said to him, "I'm not scared. I'm Scottish."
I'm mental.
Which occurred to me on the spur of a moment. But it was scary. The airport area itself had been heavily bombed the day before we flew in. And when you go into that situation, when you first arrive in that situation, your very first evening, your first moments as you come out the airport and get into the car and drive off, you're tense and worried immediately. It gradually plays on your mind a bit less as time goes on, but yeah, it was important to witness it, I think. And I'd like to make this point. The reason I went was to report what's happening. And I managed to get, and bluntly, it was extremely dangerous at the time, but I did manage to get, over the course of nearly 5 months I was in Lebanon, I did manage to get right to the front lines. I managed to get where people were being shot. And there was nothing whatsoever stopping the BBC or The Guardian from going there and reporting what the Israelis were doing in Lebanon, and none of them did. Nobody there from the BBC, nobody there from The Guardian. And it's not like Gaza where they have the excuse they can't get in. They're not there because they choose not to be there. In fact, the only time the BBC have entered southern Lebanon at all in the last year, they did so with the IDF, with the occupying forces, which is disgraceful.
Yes. I mean, was that your first time ever in a hot war zone? Had you ever done that before? I mean, did you have any previous experience that would prepare you for that?
Yeah, I was in Sierra Leone and Liberia during the Civil War
Hmm.
there, where I was involved in. I was actually the head of the UK delegation trying to negotiate a peace deal, and I flew in there by helicopter and was traveling around there, and literally, at times traveling through areas where bullets were flying. So
But you would have
uh,
had British bodyguards, I take it, at that point. You didn't have any
um,
bodyguards in Lebanon, I assume.
yeah, I had I had bodyguards, not British bodyguards, but I did have bodyguards. Yes, at that point, but it was still very dangerous. No, Lebanon was extremely dangerous. There was one time in particular when we were in Baalbek. We went to Baalbek in the Bekaa Valley and we went there specifically because the day before 60 people had been killed in the town by bombing. 60 people.
Hmm.
And we went there, and I particularly was keen to go through some of the bomb sites in the rubble to check out claims that these were military installations or Hamas was
Yeah,
storing missiles in the basement. Because if you can get within 24 hours to a place that's just been bombed, if there were missile emplacements there, you would
yeah,
be
yeah.
able to see evidence of that. You'd be able to tell what these buildings were. And we did that, and we were able to verify that they were definitely civilian homes. And we saw nothing anywhere in the rubble that indicated any kind of military use whatsoever. So that the propaganda from Israel simply wasn't true. But you had to be there to do it, to verify it. But as we were going through, there were Israeli drones circling
Yeah.
overhead. In fact, the drones followed us for over 40 miles straight overhead of us through the Bekaa Valley. There's no doubt they were following us. And I was meant to meet the governor of the northern Bekaa Valley, was meant to meet me there. But the meeting was cancelled because it was too dangerous because of the drones over our heads.
Mm.
And the people with us who were from the town council, who were in fact Hezbollah, because Hezbollah are a political party and they
Yeah, yeah.
control the town council. When we got out of our cars in the town and the drones came lower and lower over our heads, you could tell they thought we'd had it. They thought we were going to die, and we discussed what to do, and I thought it might be an idea. There were 6 of us in the group, and I thought it might be an idea if we walked off in diverse directions, into 6 different ways on the grounds that then at least we wouldn't all be killed. But the view was that dispersing, the act of dispersing, would trigger fire from a drone, and it was decided ultimately that the best thing to do was simply to stand still, just to stand there still in the middle of Baalbek with the drones circling over our heads. And we stood there for about 2 hours, I guess. But there's no doubt at all that the people who were there from the local council, they thought they were going to die. They thought any second now we were all gone. And that was testing.
I can imagine.
It was testing. I actually, funnily enough, I got extremely worried because there's a very lovely cat that kept coming and rubbing around my legs. I kept thinking, this damn cat is going to get itself killed. And I was kind of pondering in my head whether I should kick the cat and make it go away. But I love cats, so I found it. So I was trying to shoo it away gently, and it wouldn't leave. And I remember that kind of surreal experience of the Israeli drone buzzing over our heads, all the terrified people from Hezbollah, and me worried about the cat. It was a strange situation.
Perhaps the Israeli operator of the drone was a cat lover and thought, I could kill this lot, but I would hurt that. Like it would hurt the cat. I've got a vision. I saw one of your videos. I watched all of them. As actually I could get hold of. There was one where you were looking very dapper, dressed up, and you were in the middle of all this rubble. And I thought it just looks, bizarre. It did when you were so smartly dressed, and everything round about you was devastation. absolute devastation. But to let the viewers understand, the Lebanese government, if I'm not mistaken, they're not like Hezbollah. They're kind of pro-Israeli. Am I right? The Lebanese government.
The current Lebanese government is basically an American client government, which has only really been in. They had a caretaker government until 6 months ago. The new Lebanese government was installed there, and the weakening of Hezbollah by the devastating Israeli bombing is partly what enabled them to form that pro-Israeli, pro-American government. But it's a complex situation because the Lebanese government has armed forces which are literally funded by the United States. Quite literally, 50% of the salary of every member of the Lebanese armed forces is paid by the United States directly. Not they don't pay the Lebanese government to pay them. The US embassy directly pays half of the salary of every member of the Lebanese armed forces. But on the other hand, the majority of the Lebanese armed forces personnel, of the troops on the ground, the majority of them are Shia Muslims who are sympathetic to Hezbollah, even though the senior officers, many of them, their loyalty lies with the United States. So many things in Lebanon. It's a fascinating country, and all of the situations are always complex. It's very diverse. It's a very rich history. A tremendous admixture of peoples, and there's almost never a statement you can make about it without immediately having to qualify that statement.
So, do you see? Will the peace hold? I mean, peace is a word, but do you think it will hold in Lebanon?
Well, I mean, the ceasefire happened while I was there, and I never believed it would hold. I always immediately knew it wouldn't hold, and I knew why. Because the ceasefire agreement says that Hezbollah must withdraw its weaponry north of the Litani River, which is the river which Zionists who support Greater Israel want to be the border of Israel in future. They want to annex southern Lebanon. But Israel and the United States both still hold that Hezbollah is a terrorist organization. They therefore claim the right to attack Hezbollah anytime, anywhere. So Hezbollah are meant to withdraw their weaponry north of the Litani River, and that's part of the ceasefire deal. But the United States and Israel both claim the right to attack Hezbollah anywhere, anyway. So even north of the Litani River. And in fact, there's hardly a day passed since the ceasefire deal when Israel hasn't bombed Lebanon. And it's often bombed Lebanon 10, 12 times a day. And the vast majority of those Israeli attacks have been north of the demilitarized area, have been in the Bekaa Valley, have been in Beirut even. So there was never any intention to honour the ceasefire deal.
But has Israel ever honoured a ceasefire?
No. I don't think Israel's ever honoured any agreement at all of any kind it's ever entered into, ever. And that's one of the difficulties with feeling you have a God-given right, but you feel there's a divine law which overrules any obligation of any worldly treaty you may have entered into. The ceasefire in Lebanon's a farce, and people have continued to be killed since the ceasefire. But I really don't think, because as I say, people like the BBC just don't go and show you.
Yeah.
I don't think people appreciate the extent of the devastation in Lebanon. We're talking about 100,000 homes destroyed. 100,000 homes destroyed. And the majority of those, probably about a 60-40 split, weren't destroyed by bombing. They were blown up. They were dynamited during Israeli occupation. The Israelis occupied, for example, the city of Hiam and just wired it all up with explosives and blew it all up. And before they did that, they entered all the homes and looted on an industrial scale the contents of the homes. The people had to flee, flee literally with bombs. I met people who described to me, and you can see these interviews, in some of the videos I posted, who fleeing with their children as bombs dropped all around them. They didn't have time to take any of their possessions. The Israeli army occupied Hiam and just systematically looted everything of value from. If you can go through the rubble, and again, I've done this. You can go through the rubble, and you won't come across any smashed up electronic goods. You won't come across any carpets. All the valuable contents of people's homes were systematically looted by Israel, including gensets. And for those who don't know Lebanon, it has virtually no central electricity distribution because over a series of wars, all the grid has been totally destroyed. So almost all electricity distribution, electricity availability is through diesel generators. And every sort of middle-class home has its own diesel generator. In Hiam, all of the gensets, thousands and thousands of gensets, were taken by Israel. They were removed. And you can't do looting on that scale without it being organized by the state. Yeah. It would have been hundreds and hundreds of journeys of lorries picking up all these gensets and taking them away, picking up all the televisions, picking up people's art and collection of carpets. So they were from the wealthy part of the community. And I met people who had lost all their art, returned to their homes, which had been destroyed, but they were going through the rubble looking for valuable items, and they weren't there. They weren't smashed. They weren't there. The industrial scale looting involved in Israeli occupation is something in which, again, I've never seen mentioned in the media, and I've never seen properly covered. And again, we started with why I went. You had to be there to learn these things, and it's a terrible shame the mainstream media don't have real journalists anymore. I mean, Robert Fisk would have done it. That's exactly the sort of thing Robert Fisk did. He's no longer with us. There aren't figures like that.
John Pilger.
You were referring to me wearing my suit and tie, and that was partly a choice, as you say, to show contrast with the terrible, terrible devastation I was in. It was also, if you like, a fingers up to the BBC, where they cover Lebanon from Israel, and they have a BBC correspondent standing there in Tel Aviv wearing a flak jacket and a helmet. Telling you about Hezbollah rockets in southern Lebanon, and
they're actually probably reading a script that's been given to them by the IDF.
Yeah, and it definitely will have to. It will be passed through the IDF censor for sure. The BBC stuff on Lebanon from Israel, and they're in no danger whatsoever. They dress up in all this in all this stuff, and for me to be somewhere that really was genuinely extremely dangerous, just in my suit and tie, was a kind of deliberate contrast, if you like. It was and an act of defiance. It's a bugger you, I'm not scared of you statement.
Well, I'm glad you lived through it, but I mean, the fact of the matter is, the reason we don't get reported is for two, I would suggest. I don't know what you think, but I think one is massive Islamophobia in the West, and this fear of the pro-Zionist lobby that they'll come and cancel you and threaten and bully you. That's the reason. What's happening? We can see it, but we're told, it's like that phrase, the last thing you were told was to not believe what your eyes were seeing or your ears were hearing. I mean, we can see it with our own eyes, but we're getting told, no, it's not happening. It's not a genocide. No. There's nothing happening. There's no looting. It really is quite horrible. Has there ever been anything like this before in the world? Ever?
I think one of the things that makes it different is the fact that we now see the truth much more clearly, in that for a long time we could see daily from Gaza what is really happening on people's mobile phones, and from southern Lebanon to some extent we could see on the mobile phones of mobile phone footage from local people showing what was really happening. We didn't have that from Iraq. When the Americans were devastating Baghdad in 2003, killing hundreds of thousands of people in Iraq through their shock and awe campaign. And the BBC was telling us this was carefully targeted bombing and was only hitting military installations. Exactly the same propaganda we get from Israel now. We were given about the British, American, etc. invasion of Iraq in 2003. What you didn't have in those days, Iraqis able to show you footage of hundreds of murdered infants, because the mobile phone in its current form didn't exist.
Yeah.
So I think this is certainly one of the very worst examples in history of a deliberate genocide. But I think in terms of the lies being told about what's happening, I think they have happened in past wars. I think we saw similar lies in Iraq, for example. But the proof wasn't to hand to show easily, to show that they were lies. It was now. There has been. It's worth noting that the amount of stuff coming out of Gaza has diminished massively because all the citizen journalists have been killed. There have been so many citizen journalists killed that people, there are less of the more experienced citizen journalists left alive. And obviously people realize that doing it gets you killed. Plus, simple things like access to electricity, access to mobile phones, access to the internet are getting worse and worse and worse and worse every day in Gaza. So we're no longer seeing the volume of material we did from there. And it's amazing how quickly the world forgets. I'm or becomes blasé. It worries me that there's not quite the extreme public indignation that was felt a year ago. But your points are basically right, and you are absolutely right to link it to Islamophobia in the West and be, what's driving the genocide in Gaza and in Lebanon is exactly the same thing that's driving the anti-immigrant propaganda in the UK, and I think that's a very, very important link to make.
Yeah, because I noticed, for example, recently an awful lot of, I don't know, on social media talking about halal meat and how terrible it is, and it's got to stop the slaughter of animals. And it's not the exact same. It's not kosher meat's not far. The slaughter of a kosher meat and halal, there's not much difference in it. No one says a word about kosher meat, and it is just Islamophobia because it's halal meat. And we're watching it on our phones and on social media. We're seeing the killing. And our prime ministers and the presidents and the prime ministers throughout Europe are saying, no, there's no genocide. It's self-defense. Behave yourself. Anyone, and they're arresting people like yourself and Richard Medhurst and others. It is just really, we don't live in a democracy. We pretend to be Democrat. There is nothing democratic about what's happening in the Middle East, is there?
No, not at all. And as you say, there's a kind of anti-democratic blowback in the UK and across Europe and in the States, because to keep the lid on it, they have to arrest people at home who are telling the truth. And this attack on people who oppose the genocide in the West and all the arrests is horrible, and it exposes the myth of Western democracy, if you like, in many ways. But firstly, there is the attack on people like myself who've been arrested for writing about Palestine. And secondly, there's no doubt, and opinion poll after opinion poll shows it, that the vast majority of people in the West want their politicians to do something different. People do want the genocide to stop. They don't support Israel. There's a minority who do, but they really are a minority. But the majority have no ability to control the system, to control politicians.
Yeah.
And those politicians are controlled by money.
Yeah.
They've all received, all of the leading cabinet members of Keir Starmer's cabinet, all the holders of the great offices of state, all of them are members of Labour Friends of Israel. And they've all received tens of thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands of pounds in donations from the Israeli lobby.
Yeah.
And that's what is controlling it. It just is. It's a fact of life. It's not disputable.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fed into politics because if we look, for example, I think the general public are, good Scottish word, scunnered with it all because they know they're being lied to by people on this and in Ukraine. They know they're being lied to, and they see this and they think, well, we're losing respect. We're getting the lowest turnouts ever. Like in England last week, it was 9 to 30% turned out for some, 35%. And the average turnout now at by-election is about 20% because the people are thinking, what is the point? They literally are saying they're all the same.
Yeah, there's a huge disconnect from politics. Politics is now driven by a political class who are careerist. Who their reason for being in politics is their own career, not really ideology. Most of them could be in one of the other parties without any change in their belief system whatsoever. And you see that with Keir Starmer's statements on immigration. They could easily have come from a Conservative Party or from Reform. In fact, they'd be too right wing for most people in the Conservative Party. So it's it is meaningless. It doesn't make much difference at all who you vote for. And of course, in Scotland, we've had people for over a decade turn out loyally to vote for the SNP, hoping to get Scottish independence. And no matter how many times they do it, the SNP does nothing whatsoever about Scottish independence. It has no impact on the choice of independence.
Right.
So people are losing hope. They're losing faith. What's the point of continually voting SNP if the SNP aren't going to bring independence? And that, unfortunately, has led to a great deal of disillusionment. And you're right, in that the disillusionment is general across the Western world, but that's the specific form of a disillusionment in Scotland.
Which is a great segue for me to get into the second part of this interview, which is, thank you very much. I don't know if you did it on purpose, but it's really good. It makes me look professional here. You are very much going to be a spokesman using your ambassadorial skills to represent Salvo liberation at the United Nations, where they stand about to say that Scotland's a non-self-governing territory and in fact is a de facto colony. And could you tell our viewers how you're involved in that and the process, etc.?
Yeah, I will. I'm going to start off by saying I've no doubt at all that Scotland is a colony, and it astonishes me that the notion upsets many people so much, and particularly that it upsets some independent supporters a great deal, and a lot of them who come from a left-wing perspective say, yes, but you've got to look at Scotland's involvement in slavery, you've got to look at Scotland's involvement in colonialism. But every empire in history has always co-opted colonized people into its plan. That's always a part of the case. If you look at, let's say you look at India, India wasn't conquered by British troops. India was conquered almost entirely by Indian troops. They may have had British officers, but they were local people who were co-opted into the colonial project. That doesn't mean India wasn't colonized. Of course, India was colonized. The same with Scotland. Scotland was very definitely colonized. It had its religion and its culture crushed. It's had its economic resources raped and may continue to be raped. And the fact that members of the both the Scottish elite and the Scottish cannon fodder were then co-opted into the English colonial project doesn't make you not a colony. There've always been these factors in the colony, and colonies have always had their puppet assemblies. You look at Ghana, say, under the British Empire. Ghana had its elected local representatives in a local assembly who were, while it was a colony, who did the administrative work of the British. And I find it very strange that people don't have any difficulty at all recognising Ireland's colonial status, but can't recognise Scotland's colonial status. That people understand that Ireland was a colony. You say to people Ireland was a colony, nobody has any difficulty in processing that. But Irishmen were just as much co-opted into the British colonial project. There were as many Irish officers in the British armies conquering India and Africa as there were Scottish officers. Didn't make Ireland not a colony either. And what white people have difficulty processing this, I genuinely don't understand.
Yeah, I mean, the fact is that I know of some senior independence supporters, as you've highlighted. I've been at meetings where they've poo-pooed the idea. I think it offends their, offends them that they're living in it and won't admit it, because admitting it would, cognitive dissonance, actually, it has to be down to that.
It's partly national pride. I mean, it comes from, there's some people who are proud Scots who don't like to think we were colonised, and there are other people who are basically Marxist and it's against their ideological reading of the situation to accept that, if you like, white people can be colonised. That's a difficulty with some people who take an academic approach to it. But personally, I have no hesitation in saying Scotland was a colony. On the United Nations process, I'm told Liberation and Salvo that I will be extremely happy to put forward their case at the UN, drawing on my knowledge of how to work the UN system and my, both as a diplomat and then also having more recently applied those skills in lobbying on the Assange case, for example, within the UN system, and on Israel-Palestine within the UN system. So I have a good deal of experience I'm happy to put at their disposal. I'm anxious that people don't expect a very quick process, because things don't go fast at the United Nations. They don't. If you wanted to change the brand of coffee to fair trade coffee in the canteen at the UN, that would probably be a 4-year negotiating process. It's not something. The UN is not going to come out with a declaration this autumn that Scotland is a colony and should be decolonised. First of all, we have to introduce the notion to select ambassadors and diplomats, in particular those on the decolonisation committee, and we have to do that by informal contact, by meetings, lunches, drinks, chatting to them, introducing the idea to them, and getting them to look at the papers and start to think about it. And in particular, there's an absolutely excellent paper provided by Liberation Scotland on the colonial markers. And this draws on academic post-colonial theory, which is very much relevant to the United Nations intellectual position on decolonisation. So we have to get that work into people's heads. And then we have to move towards adoption by the Decolonisation Committee and the General Assembly of the idea of Scotland as being entered into the decolonisation process. That's a hard thing to do, and there will be steps on the way. One of the earliest steps, which is not so hard, could be to get recognition as a liberation movement. Now, to give to give an example, the Alaskan people got recognized as a liberation movement. The native people of Alaska, and the Alaskans now have an ambassador at the United Nations with observer status, based on that recognition. But in fact, the group of native Alaskan people who were trying to get this recognition, very small group, and not actually particularly representative of the views of many native Alaskan people, because you don't have to be. Being a small group or as a proportion of the entire nation isn't what's being considered. It's whether you are technically right about being a colonized people. But in fact, the reason that Alaska obtained some recognition was a shot across the bows of the United States. That's the important point. That you need to have a respectable technical argument, but it is not a legal process. It is not a legal judgment or legal decision. It is a political process and a political decision. And bluntly, the Alaskans got as far as they did because members of the committee hated what the United States was doing in South America and Africa and other places. And the United Kingdom at the moment is extremely unpopular. The United Kingdom is highly unpopular with the global South because of its support for Israeli genocide. It's not got the support of the European Union because it left the European Union. The United States is quite politically isolated, and there are many members on the key committees. There are countries there, like Caribbean countries like Venezuela, who will be ideologically inclined to give a fair hearing to what we are doing. So I'm ready. We now have the materials in place. We're ready to start going about this in the near future, as in the next month or two. Thankfully, the major holdup at this point is I need to get an American visa because I can't get to the state. I get blocked on the ESTA process. I don't think that's particularly because of my dissident activities. I think it's simply because of you automatically get blocked if you've ever been to Iran, Cuba, Iraq, and various other places. And as I've been to all of them at some stage, I automatically get blocked and then have to go and apply for an American visa. My American visa has just expired. And for some reason, I have to go to Belfast to get an interview for another one.
One of the questions I was going to ask you is, does it worry you? I mean, in America, they're arresting people for speaking out against Israel or speaking up for Palestine. Your views are well known. Are you not worried that when you get to JFK, wherever it is you land, that they arrest you immediately, put you in an orange suit and fire you back out again, or maybe down to Guantanamo Bay?
Yeah. I mean, it worries me all the time. I was arrested twice while I was in Lebanon and spent hours in a cell in general security in Lebanon. Spent basically on two different occasions. I spent the whole day there, and that's not the sort of place you want to end up in a cell.
A bit of a habit of getting into jail, Mr. Murray.
Yeah, and of course I've been arrested here, and I've been to jail here. All
do you have a prison tattoo? That's what I want to know.
Activity, sadly not, no. But it's. I mean, I'd be lying if I said it didn't worry me. But it doesn't stop me because the whole purpose is to stop you. So we can't let it do that. But yeah, I do wonder every time. The last time I was in the States, was about a year ago when I went for and did a speaking tour for the Julian Assange campaign.
Yeah.
And I was worried, the whole time about whether I'd be picked up, whether I'd be arrested, obviously whether I'd be let into the country in the first place. There was one incident which was really quite interesting where I went to the courthouse in, I think, Arlington, Virginia, I believe, where the trial would have been held, where if Julian had been extradited, where he would have been tried in the States, because I wanted to scout out the courtroom, scout out how you got in to report the trial, scout out where protesters would be allowed to stand and that kind of thing. And being a courthouse, it's, by law, it's open to the public. So I went down just unannounced, without saying I was going or anything. I just turned up and wandered into the courthouse, and I was immediately intercepted by several armed police. And they said, "Where are you going?" And I said, "Well, I'm coming in. It's a public building. It's open to the public. And people are allowed to come in." And they said, "Well, you can't come in here, Ambassador Murray." And the interesting thing was I hadn't told them who I was. I hadn't mentioned my name. They hadn't asked me who I was. They just said, "You can't come in here, Ambassador Murray." So obviously I'd been surveilled and followed, and I had discussed with people I was with in the States that I was going there the next day. So obviously somehow they'd picked that up or whatever. But I just give that as one example of getting used to a life under surveillance, if you like.
I mean, is there a possibility they could refuse you a visa?
Yeah. I think it is possible. I've not had any indication of that from the Americans, and some of the, and in a sense, I think that's possibly less likely under Trump, if you like, because I was a great opponent of Hillary Clinton and did what I could to further the distribution of her emails and all that kind of thing. So,
you may have some brownie points.
I may have some brownie points stored up there with the current administration, but I don't know. I mean, there's no point in worrying about it too much, and the place gets less and less safe. When I was arrested here at Glasgow Airport a while back and was then told I was under investigation here in Scotland for terrorism, I fled to Switzerland and stayed there for a few months. But Switzerland is now not safe at all. It suddenly, it has flipped. It has started arresting pro-Palestinian journalists itself, and banning pro-Palestinian meetings and all that kind of thing. So the number of places in the world which are safe and open is becoming smaller and smaller.
Yeah, in the West, that is, in the West. It's beginning to get that the global South or the East seems to be safer places or more democratic. It's quite frightening. Now, if you get into the US, how long are you likely to be there in New York?
I think on the first, I think we need to do a first visit of 2 or 3 weeks to call on key people and do lobbying and do follow-ups and things. Then with some of them, we'll stay in touch with the embassies or missions to the UN that we're in touch with. With some of them, that then may entail then going to talk to, after they report back, going to talk to officials in capital or ministers in capital, because the embassies to the United Nations will report back to their capitals, and if they get a positive reaction or reaction that wants to know more, we may then want to go to some of the key capitals to discuss things there. Then it'll be a matter of where to get it on the agenda, whether it be committee stage or the General Assembly stage in the UN, and there's a difficult procedural chicken and egg problem there, where each one. There have been quite a number of cases where each one says that they won't act without the other one acting first, and neither one ever does. And it requires political goodwill to get over that stage as well. Mm-hmm. So, as I say, I'm very anxious that people don't think this is something that can be done fast, because it just can't with the best will in the world.
And there is no way you're going to come back, like Chamberlain waving a bit of paper and say we're independent. Independence in my time. People have to understand. There's a lot of people. I mean, I've seen people going back to what we were talking about earlier, who are disengaging from the political scene and saying, "Well, I'm just going to wait. We'll get our independence from Salvo Liberation." And even no matter how many times Sarah tells them it's only part of the jigsaw, and we've got to do other things. People should, as you say, shouldn't be thinking that this is some kind of, it's going to do everything that they want them to do.
Ultimately, the important thing to remember is that independence is not a matter of your domestic law, and certainly not a matter of London's domestic law. Independence is a state in international relations. You are independent as a state in relation to other independent states. Yeah. And the body that decides if you are an independent state or not is the United Nations. Nothing whatsoever to do with the UK Supreme Court. The UN says you're independent, you are independent, whatever the UN Supreme Court says. And vice versa. You can have a situation where your domestic institutions proclaim independence and the UN says no. But it's the UN that counts, nothing domestically. And if you like, the decolonization process and entering the arguments and the discussion there is a part of a process but is leading up to what ultimately is going to be a vote on Scottish independence at the United Nations. And whatever process, even if it was via a referendum agreed with London, and personally I think that's cloud cuckoo land. I don't think London will ever agree a referendum. But even if it were that way, it would still all come down at the end to a vote at the United Nations. Ultimately, there has to be a vote at the United Nations. And what we are doing with the decolonization process is all part of sowing the seeds that lead up to that eventual vote at the United Nations. But before you get to that final vote at the United Nations, you have to have a declaration of independence here at home.
Yeah.
And you have to have control of your country. You may get a vote you may get admitted to the decolonization process without having control of your own country. But you won't ultimately get viewed as independent without having control of your own country. And the importance of that is, if you like, personally, I've got no doubt that independence is going to come through independence parties at Holyrood declaring independence against London's will. And at that stage, we need to assert control of Scotland, which is going to involve, the willingness to stand in front of British tanks. So
I'll do it.
If you like, you can view what I was doing with the Israeli drones as practice for that moment, because we are going to have to be willing to assert control. And that's why Catalonia failed. If you remember the Catalan referendum.
I was there live.
Exactly. Because the Catalans never managed to take physical control from the Spanish. And you have to be prepared to take physical control against what may be the kind of violence that the paramilitaries employed in Catalonia.
I'm up for that. But the other thing sorry, on you
go. I'd define want to try that on in Glasgow. I'm not sure it would work.
I'll be on the barricades for sure. But the other thing I'd like to ask you, because a lot of people are saying, the naysayers, the British will just veto it and you'll not get anywhere. They can't veto this process, can they?
They can't veto the decolonisation process, no, because the colonial power would always veto the decolonisation process. Of course, that's one of the advantages of going this route. It's a fascinating thing because once we get to the ultimate vote on independence at the General Assembly, arguably the Security Council might be able to veto independence, but it's hard to find precedents for that when the General Assembly has. And if you look at the case of Palestine, for example, Palestine operates as an independent state. It is recognized by quite a large majority of states in the world operating independent Palestine. Palestine is able to appear before the International Court of Justice in its own right as a state. It only has observer state status at the United Nations, but that still gives it's still given speaking rights and attends and speaks to the Security Council. But it is the Security Council veto which has stopped Palestine from being recognized as a full state. But the actual disadvantages of that are very small because Palestine, in fact, operates as a full state. The possibility that the United Kingdom could keep Scotland in that position against the will of the entire rest of the world is extremely small. The United Kingdom's power in the world is not that large, and that kind of blatant abuse of its Security Council veto would plainly put its Security Council status as a permanent member at risk, which is already at risk. Let's face it. The outdated 1946 architecture of the United Nations as being a place controlled by the victors of a war 80 years ago is already under severe attack and showing great signs of strain. So, on the decolonization process, there's no Security Council veto. On the ultimate vote on independence, there is theoretically a veto to some extent, though whether the UK would ever be in a politically powerful enough position to wield it, I very, very much doubt.
Yeah, because they have got too many people who do not like them. They don't understand that. They think they're the most popular nation in the world. Of course, the Americans think the same too. But they have got a lot of people who would actually gladly help Scotland. But the important thing is, though, people should also understand it. We have to, this disengaging from the entire political system, while I understand it, it doesn't do Scotland any favours. We need to vote in numbers and show the UN and everyone else in the world that we the people, want the independence, that we're being stopped because we are a colony. Would you agree with that statement?
Oh, I entirely agree. And it's up to those of us who aspire to help and to some extent to lead the independence movement to show people a path and a way that's viable. The problem is we've been betrayed by the SNP leadership. The SNP leadership has squandered all the fantastic chances for independence that came with Brexit, that came with Boris Johnson being in power, that come now from the Labour Party, which is more right-wing than the Tories were. And the SNP's done nothing and plainly intends to do nothing. And that's led to massive disillusionment, and that's very, very difficult. And on top of that, of course, there's an entirely hostile media environment for getting our message across. But we have to find a way, and we have to motivate people. And the support for independence is running, 15% regularly, 15% higher or more than support for the SNP. And we have to get those disillusioned independent supporters to the polls, and we have to give them something positive to vote for. But you're right. The process at home is absolutely essential. Ultimately, we've got to get to that Declaration of Independence, and what we're doing at the UN with the decolonization thing is only a part of the pathway to that. Part of numerous things you have to do to prepare the ground for that.
Well, but we should not underestimate, and we have to congratulate Salvo Liberation, who have suffered a lot of slings and arrows, but they have done a tremendous job to get this far. And whatever happens, they have to be congratulated, Craig.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. The work of Sarah and of Professor Beard in particular on the post-colonial theory stuff has been great, and numerous others. And the Scottish Sovereignty Research Group also deserve a strong praise. And these are people who have, when the paid leadership, when those who got themselves into positions of being paid by the UK state on the back of independence supporters, stopped working on independence, started thinking entirely of their own careers and their own pockets. These are people who, for nothing, kept up the progress and the fight for independence and have moved things forward. And they've moved them forward down a slightly different path, but they've moved things forward and they've given people hope and a reason to cling on. And nothing makes me angrier, to be honest, than the highly paid grifters who do nothing, criticising the people who are putting their backs into it with no personal reward, only for the love of Scotland. And I think it's very, very important to say that.
Yeah, absolutely. We have to liberate Scotland. And I think that's the way we're going to do it. Craig, can I thank you so much? And please don't frighten us again by walking about in a suit and shirt and tie in a war zone. My heart was in my mouth. I think, well, that's me lost a guest. Who can I invite on now? But I salute your bravery. I salute your tenacity. And I wish you, on behalf of Scotland, all the best when you go to New York, and that you carry our hopes with you, and may you be successful. And our congratulations to all the people involved with Salvo Liberation. And folks, I hope you've enjoyed this as much as I've enjoyed, as I always enjoy talking to Craig. And until we see you again, may you and yours take care.
Goodbye.
Through a Scottish Prism, the programme that is unapologetically pro-Scottish independence and anti-Westminster rule. Everything we say here is viewed through a Scottish prism. Brought to you by Barhead Boy.